Okay, it looks like here we are at 103, and we have so much to cover today, so let's begin. I want to welcome everyone to session 2 of REL Midwest Survey Methods webinar series, and the formal title is In Pursuit of Reliable Data, Using Surveys in Early Childhood Research. Now, today's workshop is going to cover survey administration. Yesterday was on developing a survey and writing survey items. I'm trying to change the screen and I can't, oh, there, thank you, who never did that, thank you. My name is Leslie Scott and I am the Technical Assistance Lead for the Regional Education Laboratory Midwest, and I am going to be moderating today's session. Excuse me. This webinar series is being hosted by REL Midwest through its Early Childhood Education Research Alliance. And your speaker for today is Dr. Laura Hawkinson. Now, Laura is a researcher at the American Institutes for Research, and her methodological area of expertise is quantitative research, and her substantive area is early childhood education. Laura's current REL Midwest project involves partnering with Iowa QRS Oversight Committee to develop a survey of quality improvement activities among programs in the state's rating system. And I know a lot of individuals from the Oversight Committee and that work with the Oversight Committee are here today, so greetings. As a little insight into Laura, I'm going to let you know a secret. Before joining AIR, Laura taught toddlers in a child care program for homeless families. I didn't even know that about Laura. Oops. All right. Now I'd like to begin today's session with some background on REL Midwest for folks who were not able to participate in yesterday's session. I want you to know that REL Midwest is one of 10 regional education laboratories located across the country. It's funded, the whole laboratory program is funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. And REL Midwest specifically serves the educational needs of a seven-state region, which includes Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin. And the REL Midwest is actually run and administered by the American Institutes for Research. Now, our charge is to improve students' academic outcomes by helping states, school districts, and school systems use data, conducting and supporting high-quality research and evaluations, and promoting evidence-based decision-making. Now, to achieve our mission, we work through research alliances, such as the Early Childhood Education Research Alliance, which is hosting the Survey Methods webinar series today. So I do want to encourage you to visit our website. You see it at the bottom of that slide. So visit our website to learn more about REL Midwest. And I'd also like to tell you before we move on that you can also view the recording of yesterday's session 1, which also includes more information on REL Midwest, when it becomes available on this website, on the REL Midwest website, in a couple of weeks. Okay, so I want to discuss some webinar features with you, and you can actually practice a little bit while I'm talking, just to see if you, just to make sure you feel comfortable doing this. Now, as we proceed, we encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you can see that on the left-hand side bottom of your screen. Now, this is where we will be, the chat pods will allow you to communicate with us and with each other. And so we just want you to type your message or question in that narrow rectangular box on the bottom of the chat pod, and then you can click that dialogue bubble to the right, or you can hit your return key to post your message. If people want to just practice. Okay, there's Anne Marie giving us a little tip or demonstration on how it's done. All right, and we'd like you to post your questions regarding anything. If you have technical difficulties, sound, webinar tool assistance, or other technical concerns, also please type those concerns and questions that you have in that chat box. your questions for the presenter in that chat box if you have questions during the course of the webinar. As the presenter is speaking, you can post your questions, and we'll answer them either during the session if we have time, or at the end during a Q&A session. Okay. Also, please feel free to share your stories and insights. You can talk to others while. We hope you're not talking to others while you're listening to our speaker present, but you can if you'd like to bring up different experiences that you've had. Finally, you'll be asked to respond to a few polls throughout this session, and the same thing as you did at the very beginning of the session. Just as you did at the very beginning of the session when you addressed or answered the question whether you participated in yesterday's session or not. Now, polls are multiple choice. Most of them are multiple choice questions, and you will see everyone's response in real time. So it's really kind of fun. Now I would like to hand over the session to Laura Hawkinson, our presenter for session 2.
Thank you, Leslie. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to have you, and welcome to folks who are new today to today's session. It looks like about a quarter of you were not able to join yesterday and are joining us today, and about 3/4 of you were here yesterday as well. So welcome to both groups. And so before we get started talking about administering a survey, I'll do a quick overview of what we talked about in session 1, which is about planning and developing a survey. In session 1, we discussed planning for a survey, using existing survey items, writing new survey items, and pre-testing items in the field. And a recording of both webinar sessions will be posted on the REL Midwest events webpage. You see a link here in the coming weeks. And you'll also see that the link is available in the web links box in the bottom right corner. So before we begin talking about topics for session 2, we have a single question pop quiz here to get your brains warmed up just for fun, especially for those who were able to participate yesterday. You can see what you can remember, and for those who were not, you can, guess and see what you think. So as we discussed yesterday, survey item is the term that we use for a question on a survey. This item reads, "Tell me your state of concurrence with the following idea. My child's teacher is unable to effectively develop my child's literacy and numeracy skills." And the response options are strongly disagree, disagree, neither agree nor disagree, agree, or strongly agree. Now, here at the REL, we think that there are some problems with the way this item is written. And many of these problems were discussed during yesterday's section about writing items. So on the bottom of your screen, you'll see a poll box. So in there, please take a moment to click next to all of the errors that apply to this example survey item. And I'll give you a little bit to respond. Okay, so it looks like we've got a bunch of responses here, so thanks everyone for your participation. And so just as a review, I'll walk through what each of these errors are. So the first one is the item is double-barreled, and this is actually true. And the meaning of double-barreled is that the item asks about two different things that may not always go together, making it difficult to answer. So in this case, the teacher could be effective at literacy skills, but not effective at numeracy skills, and that would make this item difficult to answer in that case. The second option here is that there's a double negative. That's also true. And a double negative means that in order to indicate positive opinion about the teacher, the respondent would have to provide a negative answer, meaning they would have to check disagree or strongly disagree to this negative statement to make a positive response about the teacher. And so this is confusing and can lead to incorrect responses. Unclear directions. Yes, the directions are also confusing. You could probably find a simpler way to explain how to indicate agreement with this item, and also it should be clear that you should only select one response. Inappropriate reading level could also be an issue. Words like concurrence aren't so commonly used. You could just say agreement here, and also terms like numeracy may be somewhat confusing. You could just say math in this question. And finally, scale cannot be used to measure agreement. This I wouldn't say is true, since the response options do indicate the level of agreement. So a way to improve this item would be to create two separate items about literacy and math, use clearer directions, common language, and frame it as a positive statement. So my child's teacher is effective at developing my child's math skills, and then the agreement would make more sense. So that's our quick overview of yesterday's session. And now, moving ahead, the focus of today's workshop is on administering a survey. And so we'll start by talking about sampling. And here we will discuss decisions about the target population or populations of survey recipients and the number of surveys to send out. Then we will talk about the data collection methods, such as web-based, paper, or telephone surveys. And finally, we'll talk about response options, so how response rates are calculated and how they affect the way the data are interpreted. So first we'll talk about sampling. And this section of the workshop is labeled as Section 5 because the first 4 sections of this workshop were during day 1, which will be available for viewing in a few weeks on our website if you were not able to attend for the first 4 sections. And sampling is the process used to select survey respondents, or those who will answer the survey. The first step in sampling is to define your target population. Your target population is the group of people that your survey results will represent. So who is your target population? Your target population will be determined by your research questions, specifically the who that is identified in the research question. So for example, if your question is, what resources do child development homes in Iowa draw on for professional development? Your target population is child development homes in Iowa. If your question is, what barriers to school improvement do parents of dual language learner children in preschool experience? Your target population is parents of dual language learner children in preschool. And you can notice that in this case, the research question doesn't specify a place, so it could be nationally. And if your question is, what professional development activities are most prevalent among kindergarten teachers, your target population is kindergarten teachers. So as you can see in these 3 options, the target population can be fairly broad or highly specific, depending on the research question. It's important to carefully define who is in your target population, because your results will apply specifically to that group. So if teachers are your target population, you can make this more specific by answering these example questions on the slide here. So which age groups or grades, which program type, what about specialists, special education teachers, and so on. If families are your target population, you can be more specific in a similar way. For example, will you include non-English speaking parents or focus on them specifically? If administrators are your target population, are you interested in center directors, program directors, or both? Do you want to include other administrative positions? If children are your target population, which ages, which languages spoken? Do you include children in special education? Do you focus on them exclusively? So very specific target populations can make sampling simpler, but remember that your survey results will apply specifically to your group and not necessarily to other types of teachers or families or administrators or children. So start with a sampling frame. A sampling frame is a complete list of all eligible members of your target population. Ideally, it has the following characteristics. It includes every member of the target population. It does not include members outside the target population, such as retired teachers or children who are no longer enrolled. It does not include duplicates, such as families or teachers who might have ended up in the list twice for some reason. And it is up to date. Now, sampling frames are relatively easy to construct for K-12 education research. You get a list of all the public schools. You might seek out a list of private schools and charter schools to add to it. Then you might get lists of the children enrolled in these schools or the teachers who are teaching these schools. In early childhood research, sampling frames are more complicated and depend on your target population. This slide lists examples of program types that you may want to draw from to create a sampling frame for early care and education research, whether on children, families, teachers, or administrators. If your target population includes diverse provider types, you may have to do some legwork to obtain a complete list of all programs in your population from these different groups. And also note that some resources may have large lists of programs that are actually not complete, meaning that some programs that are out there are not on your list. For example, child care resource and referral agencies have extensive lists of programs that get services from the CCR&Rs. But since not every program in the state gets those services, it means that those lists are not complete. So there may be programs that are missing from the list. And it's important to have a complete list. And that's something to keep in mind specifically for early childhood research. However, when you're conducting your survey, it's not necessary to include every member of the target population. If there are fewer than 1,000 members in your target population, maybe teachers in a region, you may want to do a census and invite all members to take the survey. A census means obtaining data from every single member of the target population. So it doesn't mean, specifically U.S. Census Bureau data, but any type of data collected on every member of the target population. And this is in contrast to a survey that collects data from a sample of programs. For larger target populations, high-quality survey data can be obtained with a carefully selected sample of population members. Just sort of that idea is illustrated by this graphic here. Large random samples are representative. A random sample of sufficient size will elicit approximately the same overall responses as you would get from a census of your target population. Larger random samples will yield more precise estimates than smaller samples. For example, assume that the proportion of all parents, your target population, who favor school uniforms is 60%. In case 95% of the time, a random sample of 1,000 parents will give you an estimate of 57% between 57% and 63% favoring school uniforms. 95% of the time, a random sample of 500 parents will give you an estimate between 55.6% and 64.4% favoring school uniforms. So this illustrates the range of error you may get related to the true percentage in the population. With a sample of 500 parents, you could get an estimate of 64% when the true percentage among all parents is 60%. And this seems pretty close, but if you wanted a more precise estimate, you would need a larger sample size. The size of the survey sample depends on how precise you need your estimates. How many should you sample? The number depends on the following: the importance of decisions that will be made based on your survey results. Larger samples produce estimates with higher levels of precision and confidence. How many subgroups of interest you have? You need a large enough sample of each subgroup for precise subgroup estimates. The fact that not everyone sampled will participate, so sample more than you need for precise estimates. And of course, your available budgets. Now we'll talk about how to randomly select from the sampling frame that you've created. For a simple random sample, all members have an equal chance of selection. To select a simple random sample, you can use Microsoft Excel. You make an Excel spreadsheet that includes the sampling frame, meaning your list of all members of the target population. Then you add a random number column and use the RAND command that's shown in quotation marks here to assign a random number between 0 and 1 to each case, meaning each member of the target population in your list. Next, you use the sort command to sort the file by the random number column. And note that when you do this, the numbers in the random column will recalculate themselves, but you don't need to worry about that because your list is now randomly ordered. From this randomly ordered list, you select the number of rows equaling your sample size. So for a sample size of 500, you select the first 500 rows that list target population members. And here is let me click ahead here. Here is an example of this technique in Excel. Columns A and B have program, it's a little hard to see this, but they have program ID numbers and names that I just made up. They're not real. Column C has random numbers generated by the RAND function shown in the large box toward the top of the screen here. The next step would be to sort programs by column C. If you need a sample of 50, then after sorting, you would pick the first 50 programs at the top of the sorted list. And the red arrows here just show some examples of programs that got fairly low random numbers, and it depends on how many programs there are, but perhaps after sorting, these might end up in your sample, whereas the others would be less likely to because of their relatively higher numbers. So that's how it works. Random samples can be stratified. To ensure that your sample matches the population on the distribution of important characteristics, such as region, race and ethnicity, or home versus center-based care, you can select a stratified random sample. This forces the sample to match the target population on the distribution of the important characteristics. This can increase the precision of your estimates compared with a simple random sample of the same size. And in the simple random sample, is what we just did, where everybody goes in the same long list and then gets sorted by a random number. To select a stratified random sample, create separate frames for each group. Randomly select the number of cases needed in each group so that your sample will have the same percentage of members in each group as the target population. This can be difficult to wrap your head around, so here's an example, a specific example. You have 10,000 children total in your target population, and 80% of them are non-English language learners. 20% of them are English language learners. Now, you're going to create two separate sampling frames, just like we did before in our Excel file, except you will have two Excel files. You will have a non-English language learner sampling frame with 8,000 children, which is 80% of 10,000, and your English language learner sampling frame will have 2,000 children in it. Okay, now for your survey, you want a total sample size of 2,000 that is stratified by English language learner status. First, you go to your non-English language learner sampling frame file and use that random selection process we just did in Excel to select 1,600 children who are not English language learners. Then you go to your English language learner sampling frame, which is a different list, and you randomly select 400 children. So that's how it works. Stratification can be done for more than one characteristic. For example, you can select a sample of teachers that matches the population of teachers both by classroom age groups and by years of teacher experience. First, you determine the cell percentages from your total population. So what percentage of all teachers in the population teach infants and have less than 3 years of experience? 8%, so that's what you see in the example table. This is in your population. And 20% of the infant teachers in your population have 3 to 10 years of experience. So that is what you see there. Then you create a separate sampling frame for each cell in the table. So for this example, you will have 9 separate sampling frames. As you see, there are 9 cells here. And then you sample within each of these 9 frames accordingly. So let's say your total sample size is 1,000. You will need 80 infant teachers with less than 3 years of experience, because that is 8% of 1,000. You make your sampling frame of all the infant teachers in your population with less than 3 years of experience, do the random number sorting, and select the first 80 of them. And you do that for all 9 of your sampling frame files. Stratification groups are determined by the target population and the focus of research. Here are some examples of stratification groups that might be used with different types of target populations in early childhood survey research. There are many other stratification groups you might identify for each type of target population, depending on the focus of the survey and the questions you want to answer with it. Should we always aim for the largest number of completed surveys? Online surveys are relatively inexpensive, so why not just invite everyone and get a lot of completed surveys easily? That's not necessarily a good plan. In general, the higher the proportion of the selected sample that responds to the survey, the more representative the survey results are likely to be. Response rates are a key consideration for the representativeness of the sample, and we'll come back to this more later. Here's an example. There are 40,000 parents of preschool children in the target population. which situation will give you the most representative data? And we have a poll that will begin in a moment. There we go. In the poll box, please click next to the situation that you think will give you the most representative data. The first option is a random sample of 3,000 parents is selected to receive a survey. You receive 2,500 completed surveys. The second option is you attempt a census. 14,000 surveys are distributed and get 10,000 completed surveys. So please go ahead and cast your votes. Give another couple of seconds here as folks think. Okay, great. So we'll end the poll now. Well, this is great. All of you thought that 2,500 responses in the sample of 3,000 would give you more representative data, and that is correct. And here's why. A sample of 2,500, which is 83% of the randomly selected sample, can give you more representative data than a sample of 10,000, which is 25% of the population. And these two graphs here just sort of illustrate what that looks like. But I think everyone got that, everyone that responded. For example, if the survey is gauging interest in wraparound care, and parents interested in the service are eager to respond to the survey, results from the 10,000 eager parents would overestimate interest. So resources are better spent on increasing the response rate of a smaller random sample rather than on administering, processing, and analyzing 10,000 surveys that may not be very representative. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the response rate section later, but this is to help you understand the justification for random sampling. A note on convenience sampling. Convenience sampling is the process of collecting data from the population members who are easiest to reach. Avoid convenience sampling for data analysis and reporting purposes because the results can be biased. For example, a survey on interest in training might be easiest to administer to teachers while they're already at a training, but these teachers may have higher than usual interest in any training, so results will not necessarily represent interest in training among teachers in general. Convenience sampling may, however, be useful for field testing a survey. In yesterday's session, we talked about field testing, which includes cognitive interviews and piloting the survey to see if there are ways to improve it before administering it to the full sample. So if anyone wants to check out the first session, it will be available on our events, REL Midwest events page in a couple of weeks. There are other sampling possibilities as well that are a bit more complex. One is intentional oversampling of rare subgroups to ensure an adequate sample size of those rare subgroups. For example, if you want to make estimates that are accurate for different racial and ethnic groups of families, but find that you have a very low percentage of some particular group, you might oversample that group. Another example is when you have two-stage sampling, first randomly selecting programs, and then randomly selecting respondents such as teachers or families from within the randomly selected programs. These methods can be useful but require special technical considerations, including creating weights for the data. So consider hiring a sampling statistician for these types of surveys, especially if they're large scale and high stakes. Now, this is the last slide for sampling, and I'd like to pause for a moment if anyone has questions before we move on to the data collection methods section. You can type them right into your chat box. Okay, so I don't see any questions coming up yet. We'll have another chance at the end to go back for any questions. And I think Anne-Marie has been answering some as we go as well. Now, moving on to topic 6, we'll talk about data collection methods. We will talk about options or modes that are available for collecting data, common terms and definitions, considerations when determining what mode is right for your project, advantages and disadvantages of different data collection methods, best practices for common modes, and we'll have some practical tips as well. What is a mode? A mode is the way in which you contact sampled respondents and collect information from them. It's composed of 3 things: how you contact respondents, in person, by telephone, by mail, through the web, how you administer the questions, interviewer versus self-administered, and how you collect the data, such as paper versus automated. Different combinations are available for each. You can use a computer, paper and pencil, or some combination of both. Generally, mode is categorized as follows: paper and pencil, which is self-administered; telephone, which is typically done by an interviewer; web-based, which is also self-administered; and in-person interviews, which are also done by an interviewer. And now we'd like to hear from you. What type of survey are you most likely to respond to? You'll see the poll here on your screen, so please click next to the one type of survey that you're most likely to respond to, and I'll give you a minute to answer. Okay, any other responses? Oh, we're getting a couple more. All right, so I'll end the poll here, and it looks like the majority went with web-based surveys, or maybe everyone in the end there chose web-based. And personally, I also agree. I'm most likely to respond to a web-based survey because I can do it on my own time and from any computer. But that's not always the case for everyone. So telephone and in-person surveys tend to have the highest quality of data. There's minimal error and fewer missing responses. However, they are more expensive than self-administered surveys. In-person interviews, you have to require you to pay a person to travel and interview respondents. And telephone surveys require some capacity to administer surveys over the phone, such as having a call center set up. Response rates for telephone surveys are often low. Self-administered surveys, both paper and pencil and web surveys, do have advantages, but you rely on the respondent to complete the survey alone. There are literacy considerations to take into account in self-administered surveys, including language barriers and the reading level of the respondents. Directions must be clear to eliminate respondent confusion because there's no interviewer to provide clarification. Pilot testing of the survey is especially important and should be conducted to ensure clarity and easy comprehension of the survey items. And this slide shows you some of the advantages and disadvantages of self-administered paper surveys. The advantages are it does not require knowledge about or access to computers or technology. It can be created quickly, can be administered anywhere, and there's no need to hire survey interviewers. Some disadvantages include oftentimes there are low response rates. They can be prone to respondent error if you have complicated skipping rules or if there are language limitations. Forms can get lost. Responses must be entered into a database one way or another, and there is the expense of postage and printing. And here are some of the advantages and disadvantages for self-administered web surveys. The advantages include you do not have to collect the paper copies. Responses are automatically stored in a database, so there's no data entry. There's automatic navigation of complex skip rules can be programmed into the web survey. You typically get faster responses and the costs are minimal. Some disadvantages include respondents need access to computers. There can be possible response bias if a lot of respondents can't get onto computers. They take more time to develop than paper surveys because of the programming requirements of the web software. And they tend to have lower response rates than if you're just using email. And here we have some questions to ask yourself when you're choosing a mode. The first set of questions is related to the target population. One question is, how difficult is the survey in relation to respondent language and literacy levels? If the literacy level of the survey is relatively difficult for respondents, it is best to do in-person or phone surveys with an interviewer to assist and provide clarification. If it's less difficult, any mode is okay. And note that Microsoft Word has a feature you can enable to display readability statistics as part of your spell check function in Word. And that feature gives you an estimated grade level for the document to help you assess how difficult the document is likely to be for respondents. Another question is, what contact information is available for respondents? You can figure out which modes are feasible based on what type of contact information you have for those in your sampling frame. For example, if you want to send out links to a web-based survey by email, you'll need to have email addresses for everyone. Another question is, how much computer access and computer literacy do respondents have? If members of your target population have low computer literacy or may not be able to get access to computers, you might consider other options besides a web survey. Another question related to target population is, does it matter if someone other than the sampled respondent, such as a spouse, completes the survey? If that does matter, it may be better to have an interviewer conduct the survey either in person or by phone to verify who's responding. So this slide has more questions to ask in choosing a mode, and this set of questions is related to survey design and the types of questions to be asked. One question is, how long is the survey? Shorter is always helpful for completion rates, but with longer surveys, it can help to have an interviewer encouraging completion in person or on the phone. Another question is, what types of item responses are in the survey? If there are a lot of questions with open-ended text responses, a web-based survey can be best because respondents can write as much or as little as they want, and there's no issue of recording the data, which can be a challenge in other types of survey modes. Another question is, does the survey include terminology that may be confusing or have multiple meanings to respondents? If there's confusing terminology, it's best to have an interviewer conduct a survey in person or by phone to provide clarification when needed. Another question related to survey design and types of questions is, how complex is the survey to complete in terms of skip patterns and response instructions? Highly complex surveys are difficult for respondents to complete on their own in paper-based forms because the instructions can be difficult to follow. Web surveys are great for complex responses because the web survey software can be programmed to automatically follow skip patterns and response instructions. You just have to double check that everything got programmed correctly, but this is one good way to do it. And also, trained interviewers can do this in person or by phone as well. And here's an example of a survey, some survey items from a survey that includes complex skip patterns. Depending on the response to question 2, respondents must navigate to different item numbers as shown in this red circle here. Now, these instructions may be difficult for respondents to follow on their own in a paper and pencil survey, or some people simply won't even notice them. And this leads to error in their responses. So a web, in-person, or phone survey mode might be better for this particular survey example. So this slide has more questions to ask in choosing a mode. It's a lot to consider. This set of questions is related to costs and resources available for the survey. One question is, how large is the budget for survey administration? In-person and telephone surveys are the most expensive. Paper surveys are moderate depending on how many surveys get printed and mailed. And web surveys tend to be the least expensive. Another question is, can incentives be offered to encourage survey completion? Incentives help response rates for any mode, especially paper or web. Another question is, what is the time availability of agency staff to manage survey administration? Web surveys take time to program, but in most cases they require less survey administration time overall than other modes because other administration tasks can be automated, including contacting respondents to follow up with them, initially contacting them, and also data entry is automatic. Another question related to costs and resources is, what other staff and resources are available? For example, a call center and staff are needed for phone surveys, programmers are needed for web surveys, interviewer staff who can travel are needed for in-person surveys, and data entry staff or scanning equipment are needed to process paper surveys. So this is the final slide with questions to ask in choosing a mode. The first question is related to the planned use of survey data. It is, how soon are the data needed? If the data are needed quickly, web or phone surveys tend to be faster. And then the final question relates to the setting of the survey. Where will the survey be administered? If the survey will be administered in a public or group setting, paper surveys allow for more privacy. So you can see that there are many considerations, and you can ask yourself all of these different questions to weigh the advantages and disadvantages and come up with the best option for your specific survey circumstances. And here are some implementation steps for paper surveys. Start planning early. Identify contractors or staff to print and scan surveys. Allow additional time for scheduling, reviewing mock-ups, discussing pricing options, and other logistics. And identify a survey coordinator who will do the following. Coordinate the survey administration and act as the point of contact. Collect and send surveys to the scanning vendor and monitor response rates, and follow up with non-respondents. And the role of the survey coordinator is really very important because someone needs to be able to oversee the entire process of administering the survey. So this is an important thing to think about in planning, really any type of survey. Again, the implementation steps for a web survey are start planning early, always start planning early. Select the web-based survey software. Some districts or state agencies have data systems already in place. You can see some examples here. And also commercially available online programs are available. SurveyMonkey is familiar to many people. Zoomerang and SurveyGizmo or Web Surveyor are some others. Allow time to program the online survey and multiple rounds of testing before the survey goes live. Once again, identify a survey coordinator who will also ensure that the programming takes place successfully, and leave time to talk with the IT team and make sure invitations get sent out. Implementation steps that apply to both paper and web surveys also include establishing a data collection window. Often towards the end of the year is a good time. Avoid conflicts with other surveys and program or school or district activities. Make sure that computers or computer labs will be available for web surveys. And for paper surveys, allow additional time to administer the survey and follow up with non-respondents. And then it's also a good idea to identify other ways to get the word out through newsletters or meetings or any, venue that you're aware of to get news to respondents that you'd like to contact. And also identify any respondents who might need special accommodations, help with the literacy level or language of the survey, and that sort of, or that sort of thing. Other considerations: review sample data before sending out the survey to make sure the sample came out as planned, and if not, redo the sampling as needed. Data security is very important, especially when it's sensitive data. Be sure to use IDs instead of names and have a plan for storing the data securely. So for paper surveys, you can use barcodes or unique IDs to track responses and progress with the survey. For web surveys, you can provide users with login IDs, and consider using passwords so that respondents can return to the survey if interrupted. And if the topic is sensitive, or if you promise confidentiality to respondents, ensure that respondents can't be identified when you report on survey responses. And you can also consider what personal identification is collected with the survey data and whether it's necessary. So you don't need to collect identifying information that won't be needed for the survey analysis. And this is just another list of web survey software types that are commercially available. So this is the last slide for data collection methods. And again, I'd like to pause for any questions before we move on to talk about response rates. So I'll give everyone a moment if they want to type any questions in the chat box. And Anne-Marie asked a question in the chat box here. Oh, let's see. Our early childhood education providers in Iowa likely to respond to a web-based survey? And Jeff replied, directors are more likely to respond to web-based surveys. So that's interesting. Centers are pretty responsive, homes perhaps less so. And rural areas have smaller bandwidth and have difficulty getting on the web. So that's helpful to think about and thinking about possible differences in responses. Are there any questions or comments before we move on? We'll have another chance at the end as well. Okay, so in section 7, we'll talk more about response rates, how to calculate them, and why they matter. A response rate is the percentage of people who completed and returned the survey questionnaire compared with the total number of surveys that were intended to be completed. It's a measure of the level of success or quality achieved in collecting survey data. To calculate a response rate, you divide the number of completed surveys by the total number sampled. Then to turn that into a percentage, you multiply by 100, and we have this formula here. So this is how you calculate the response rate. So for example, if you send out 200 questionnaires and you get 125 completed questionnaires in the end, you divide 125 by 200, you get 0.625, you multiply that by 100, and it's 62.5%. Response rates are important because they're one way to gauge if your survey results are representative. A high response rate maximizes the chances that the results are representative of the target population. A low response rate increases the chances of biased results which cannot be generalized to the population. There's no standard or magic response rate. Use caution, however, in making policy decisions based on survey data with fairly low response rates. Higher response rates typically mean your data will better reflect the population, but that is not always the case. So regardless of your response rate, you should gather some information about respondents and non-respondents. If the characteristics of the survey respondents are very different from those of non-respondents, data should not be generalized even if the response rate is actually relatively high. If the characteristics of the survey respondents are the same as the non-respondents, then it's okay to generalize to your results to the population, even if the response rate is low, although more typically, low response rates, you often will not find that the characteristics are similar, but if they are, then you may be okay. So for example, if you send out a survey about training courses, you should figure out if the teachers that did not respond have different characteristics than those who did respond. So for example, if the non-responders tend to have much lower education levels than the responders, you should be careful and keep in mind that your survey results about training may not apply to teachers with lower education levels. Comparing respondents and non-respondents provides you information about non-response bias. If those who responded to the survey are different from the people who did not respond, then there's a potential for non-response bias, which harms validity of the results. It weakens your ability to draw accurate conclusions about your population. So the example I just described on the last slide would be non-response bias related to teacher education level. If there are large differences between respondents and non-respondents, then do the following. Describe your results in terms of those who did respond. Do not imply that the results apply to anyone other than those who responded, and specify who responded. So when you, for example, when you report about the survey results in the example I just had on the last two slides, you would want to explain that the results apply to the group of teachers who responded to the survey who tend to have higher than average levels of education. And here's an example of how to acknowledge the response rate in the survey. If response rates are low, use a summary statement in reporting the results, such as the following. The response rate was only 42%, so care should be taken when reviewing these results. The results should not be applied, or should be applied only to those who responded, not the entire population of teachers. So what influences response rates? Salience of the topic and interest in the topic of the survey. Personalized requests and communications can be helpful in improving response rates. Multiple follow-up contacts can also be helpful in encouraging people to respond. Developing or ensuring that there's respect and trust felt toward the sponsor of the survey can help. And conciseness and easiness of the questionnaire also help. And also to maximize response rates, generate positive publicity for your survey, appeal to people's tendency, ask them to help by providing their input. This can be a very effective way to encourage people to respond, making them feel that they're helping. And make the survey topic salient. So ensure that the respondents see the value of the survey and their responses and point out their personal connection to the topic. More steps include tailor and personalized communications about the survey and its purpose. Make the questionnaire attractive and easy to complete and return. Provide clear instructions on how to complete and submit the survey. Show positive regard, say thank you, and ensure the privacy of the information provided. And provide an incentive or a token of appreciation for a mail survey